So this lecture is considering how a utilitarian would think about the issue of climate change. And it should be obvious that the same arguments that applied to our obligations to people who were distant in space should apply to people who are distant in time. So in the same way, as we saw that we all agreed that if we were walking by a pond with someone drowning and it cost us very little, certainly not anything compared to the loss of life involved, that we would have a moral obligation to jump in the pond and help the person who is drowning. So if we changed it to make it so that the person was in the future and we had the chance to travel to the future and save them if we wanted to, like in Groundhog Day, where the person, when he repeats the same day over and over again, saves the guy who's going to choke or saves the boy who's going to fall out of the tree. So we think that we would have an obligation to save those future people if the cost to us was relatively little. Or if we knew with certainty that building a fence around our pool would stop the 2-year-old next door from falling in it and drowning. And I think we all agree that we would have an obligation to do so. So the principle of equality that's part of utilitarianism, that all pleasures count and they all count the same, that we must measure equals equally, it seems to apply to future people as well. And if there's something we can do today to prevent great suffering in the future, it seems that we have an obligation to do so. So you can watch this little video that explains, has Peter Singer explaining how he applies his view of happiness to climate change. So in the reading that we had for today, Singer is discussing some of the problems in applying utilitarianism to future generations. In particular, he considers a problem that he calls the asymmetry, and that the asymmetry here is that we seem to have contradictory beliefs about how we regard the happiness of future generations. On the one hand, he thinks it's obvious that we believe that poor prospects for happiness is a good reason not to have children. We think that it would be bad to have a child if you knew that their life would be one of misery and pain. On the other hand, we don't always think that it's a good or a sufficient reason to have children just because their prospects for happiness in the future are good. So if we're rich and we can assume that we're living in a good environment and any children that we have will have good and happy lives, we don't think that that justifies us having 23 children, or we don't think we're morally obligated to have 23 children, despite the fact that those 23 children would have a great deal of happiness. More happiness would be in the world because of their existence if they had good lives than would if they didn't. And it would seem that utilitarianism would require that the greatest good for the greatest number, if we include future generations as well, would require us to have as many happy children as we could have to maximize the total happiness in the world. And Singer's reason for bringing this up isn't because he has a particular interest in this contradiction or in future generations, but because he thinks that it reveals some difficulty that we have when we try to imagine the happiness of future generations and try to answer the question, how good does a life have to be in order to justify bringing a child into the world? And of course, that's the basis of the interesting question that he asks in the article that you read. And of course, I don't think Singer is taking this seriously as a real moral issue. In fact, he says he thinks that we shouldn't, that it probably is a good thing that future generations of human beings will exist. And he's optimistic enough to think that we'll figure our problems out and we'll have many future generations that will have good lives. But if climate change were to progress to the point where the Earth were completely ruined, and we could expect that any future generations would have miserable and suffering lives, like in some of the post-apocalyptic horror stories that we like to watch on TV. Singer asks us, would it be a better thing, according to utilitarianism, to agree not to have children, if indeed the net happiness of all the future generations of mankind like in Terminator or The Matrix or something, were thought to be negative, then it might be reasonable that it would be better for us if we refused to reproduce and made this the last generation of human beings, because then all of that suffering in the future would be gone, and we would have maximized the greatest happiness for the greatest number by eliminating all of that unhappiness from existence. But we're wondering, certainly that seems counterintuitive. This seems like another counterexample to utilitarianism. We might wonder, do those non-existent persons, despite the fact that they're leading suffering lives, do they have a right to come into existence? Just as we wondered, do all the possible happy children that we can have, do they have a right to come into existence? Do we have an obligation to procreate, to produce as many happy people as possible? And do we have an obligation to prevent the future existence of possible people whose lives might be misery? Or do they have some other type of right to exist? So obviously this is relevant to climate change, because part of the cause of climate change is the rapid increase in population on the planet Earth. We wouldn't have to be worrying about climate change if the population on the planet Earth was still at the level that it was in, say, 1950 or in 1800. And you can see that our action can change the different possible paths that the population of the Earth can take. Either if we, have increased the reproductive rate by half a child per couple, population spins up to almost double what it is now. Whereas if we reduce it, it reduces down to more manageable levels. And we might ask, does making the world, these people, these 6 billion people who might be left, would all live perhaps happier lives, more free of suffering? But there would be twice as many people here who might be living in a post-apocalyptic, post-climate change world. How do we balance the lesser amount of happiness for this 20 billion people against the greater sum of happiness for the 6 billion people? And again, do those possible people have a right to come into existence? So that's one type of problem that Singer asks us to think about in that article that we just read. And that's one type of objection that people have to the obvious conclusion that we have a clear obligation to do something about climate change and to allocate significant amounts of our resources to change it and to remedy the effects that it's having. So we've just considered this first objection, that we have obligations to persons that don't exist now. Another powerful objection is going to be that the risks and rewards of different actions are uncertain. The difficulty with trying to calculate future happiness is, of course, those states in the future are uncertain. And it's uncertain which of our different possibilities will have what effect and how much effect that they'll have. And of course, in the case of climate change, that's compounded by the fact that there is significant financial and political incentive for some interested parties to ignore and to obfuscate the facts. So it's quite difficult to determine, perhaps you might think, exactly what the dangers of climate change are, exactly what we can do about them, and exactly what the effects of various different courses of action might be. So in general, utilitarians, as we saw, have trouble figuring out how to balance happiness versus pain when the outcomes of a particular event are uncertain. And we'll talk about a little bit more about expected value theory and how utilitarians handle that. And a third objection is more of a libertarian objection, because the costs of action will be split unequally. Certain people will have to pay, and those people will probably be different from the people who are actually responsible for emitting the greenhouse gases that have caused climate change. And of course, they will probably be a different group of people than the people who will suffer most from climate change. Again, utilitarianism is often objected to by libertarian theories that suggest that we don't have a social contract that requires us to care about the welfare of all people. And of course, this is magnified by the fact that climate change is an international problem. And most political theorists think that international law is like a state of nature. There is no government that governs the actions of different states with respect to each other. So they're all, we don't have a social contract with Germany or with China or with Russia. And therefore, the libertarian would think that we don't have obligations with respect to those nations. And likewise, utilitarianism might have trouble with those who think that we're responsible for our actions and we're responsible only for the redress of the effects of our actions. In this case, the person who pays the cost, the person who's responsible for the damage, and the person who suffers the damage might all be different people and might be distributed unequally. So, for example, you can see that there's a vast inequality in the amount of greenhouse gases that are due to different countries. China, at least in the last couple decades, has been the leader, with the United States and Russia, close behind. Historically, over the entire history of the Industrial Revolution, probably Russia has emitted the most greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Um, but you can see that a couple countries, developed countries, emit more greenhouse gases than the rest of the world. And you can also see sometimes we think that by driving less or not running your air conditioner or by recycling, you'll save the world and save the environment. But you can see that a relatively small portion of the greenhouse emissions are due to the electricity that we would use in our houses and due to the emissions of our cars. A much larger portion is due to industry and agriculture. And even more difficult is seeing that just how much of that emission is due to a small number of corporations. These few corporations emit about 35% of the total greenhouse gases. So we might wonder how much personal responsibility you have for that. This is like our problem in the case of poverty that Singer mentioned, of fair responsibility or doing your fair share of the action. In this case, we have some reasonable certainty that our ability to affect change by changing our behavior is very small compared to political action and international action and compared to the action of various different corporations. And of course, who suffers is very different as well. Again, the mass of greenhouse emissions comes from this area, yet those who will suffer the most fatalities and the most economic burden of climate change and rising ocean levels and drought and extreme weather events live in this region. Again, this is compounded by the fact that that's also a region that had been impoverished by the colonization and still feels the effect of the colonization of their lands by European and American explorers and colonists. So let's consider the second objection about the uncertainty of the data. You can watch this little video that tries to set forth what now is the consensus of almost every rational person on the planet, with the exception of severely interested fossil fuel corporations or political interests that serve those fossil fuel corporations. So it might seem that the utilitarian argument for doing something drastic about climate change is clear. The risks from various different effects. 821 million affected by hunger caused by climate change, 2 million people displaced, over 1,600 deaths associated with heat waves and wildfires, the destruction of our ocean ecosystems, 35 million people affected by floods. You can see a great deal of suffering, and this is just in the immediate future, within the next decade or so, and in the future, they'll be even greater. And you can see that the costs of not doing anything is dwarfs the costs of doing something, of performing action. So the utilitarian balance seems to be in favor of doing something about it. The total cost of doing something that would prevent it is much less than those damages. Of course, the difficulty is those damages are uncertain. They're in the future, and other things might intervene between now and then that might change or affect this estimate of the happiness involved. You can watch this little video about how important it is to act now and the acceleration of climate change in the most recent years. So we had seen how utilitarianism handles uncertain risks. We simply take the amount of happiness that you can expect in a possible scenario and multiply it by the probability of that scenario happening. So if you've got a 10% chance to win $5, then you would multiply the 0.10 times 5 and see that your expected value would be 50. So we can see that even though if we can put a probability or a certain certainty on certain types of risks and costs and happinesses involved, then utilitarianism should be able to calculate how rational and how morally obligated we are to take certain types of actions against climate change. And one of the first philosophers to think about what we call probability and expected value theory was Blaise Pascal, the 17th century French theologian and philosopher. His argument for God's existence is called Pascal's wager. We didn't really know whether God exists or not, so Pascal was thinking, should I wager? How rational is it for me to bet that God exists versus how rational it is for me to take the chance that God doesn't exist? If God doesn't exist, then I can enjoy myself without worrying about the various different rules that get in the way of my pleasure in this life. Whereas if I wager that God doesn't exist and it turns out that I'm wrong, then I get the infinite loss of pain in hell for all eternity. And what Pascal's wager shows is that even if you're pretty sure that God doesn't exist, the reward of getting it right, if he does exist, and the reward, the punishment for getting it wrong is so catastrophic, is such a great disaster, an eternity of suffering, is so much suffering, even if there's only a 1% chance of being true, the suffering and the payoff is so great that even for a 1% chance, I'd be wiser to act as if God existed. Now, you should see how this is relevant to climate change, because even if there's a tiny, tiny possibility of some existential disaster that would cause the wipeout of life on Earth, it would cause the suffering and the death of a large portion of the Earth's population, even a very small probability of that happening would be a good reason to act. Peter Singer is responsible for formulating a version of utilitarianism that tries to take into account expected value theory and say that we not only have the responsibility to do what produces the greatest good for the greatest number, but we have the obligation to take into account probabilities and the effectiveness of our actions. He calls this effective altruism, that we have an obligation to take into account the different probabilities and to act in the way that is most effective. We saw ourselves talking about that when we asked which of the various different charities is likely to have the best effect if we're obligated to give money to the poor. So in the same way, we're obligated, according to Singer, to consider um, impartially all the different alternatives and consider their probabilities. We're obligated to prioritize the different possible risks and act in ways that prevent the most serious. We're obligated to act in ways that have the greatest effectiveness instead of just acting in what's right in front of us and perhaps only affected one person. We should step back and be impartial and look at the bigger picture so that our actions can save the most people possible. So we shouldn't just take national action because we happen to be in the United States and only do what helps us. We should take a step back and think globally in ways that produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And we should optimize our choices by considering all the different possible counterfactual alternatives and seeing which one produces the most happiness. So you can see, you can watch this video and hear Singer talking about how utilitarianism using effective altruism theory would consider the types of extinction risks that are present in climate change.